Okay, welcome to week 8 of my Unhitched webinar short series. These are a series of short, easily digestible webinars. Sometimes an hour is just too much. Going over some of the issues and questions I get most in my practice. And this one today is a biggie. Today we're going to be talking about how to manage your mind. And a webinar short is definitely not enough to cover all of this, but we're going to do our best so I can share some of the things that I think may help you most. So you are in the right place if you're feeling a bit stuck or unhappy in your marriage, and you've got a lot of fearful, painful, uncomfortable thoughts. These are thoughts that basically keep you stuck, and they're just running on narrative loop. And while they look different for each person, there's usually some common themes that run through them. And so, as I mentioned, they can be painful thoughts. So thoughts like, I'm a bad person for not wanting to be in my marriage. They can, of course, be fearful thoughts. We talked about fear last week. They can be thoughts that create anger and resentment, things like, my spouse should care more. So basically, any thoughts that cause you suffering, those are the thoughts that we're going to be talking about here today. And those thoughts are basically a trigger that will let you know if you need to be examining them. Any thought that causes suffering falls in this category. So I'll tell you a little bit about who I am before we dive in deeper. So my name is Sunny Joy McMillan, and I am a recovering attorney and a practicing coach. I am the author of the book Unhitched, Unlock Your Courage and Clarity to Unstick Your Bad Marriage. I'm also the host of the radio show Sunny in Seattle, and my work has been featured in Oprah Magazine and Best Self and Hay House Radio and some other places. But as I've been saying throughout these webinars, I think the primary credential that I want to share most is that I've been where you are. I was unhappy in my marriage. My marriage ended in divorce. Yours doesn't have to, but that was, I think, what was best for us. So I have been there when it comes to painful, fearful, angry thoughts, and the kind of thoughts that kept me stuck in one place for quite some time. So what we're going to do today, if you relate to this, is spend about 20 minutes, and I'm going to be telling you basically some tips on how to manage your mind, because these thoughts feel very, very real, and the suffering that they create is very, very real. So we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do to manage those thoughts. I won't be taking any questions today, but if you do have questions and you want to take this further, I will share how to do that at the end. And of course, you can continue to show up to these webinars. So let's just talk about some mind management basics. So just to kind of set the stage and a big, like an overarching preface for all of this. So we have, as humans, around 60 to 80,000 thoughts a day. That's a lot. Many of them are repetitive, and the vast majority are negative. And I've mentioned this on previous webinars, but it doesn't make a lot of sense for people like, why is our mind like that? And it's just, you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, that the people who were constantly on the lookout for what was going to kill them or jump out from behind the bush, or were constantly kind of perseverating on how to stay alive and survive, those were the folks that survived. And so we have a brain that fires constantly, and it wants us to stay alive. And even though we don't have the same threats that we did back in our very early human days, we still have a lot of thoughts that can really halt you in your tracks. The brain is still firing in the same way and at the same rate that it did before. It's just applying it to different things now. For example, your marriage. So I want to share, this will be my one big quote for today that I will share with you, and I'll share my screen on this. But this is one of my favorites when it comes to mind management. And let me just pull this up. This is from Epictetus, a Greek philosopher. I hope I got that name right. So he wrote that we are disturbed not by what happens to us, but by our thoughts about what happens. Now, I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. So let me just go back to my regular screen. So basically, you can have a thought about something and it feels very, very real and it creates suffering, but the thing is, it may not even be, that may not be the real story, or it may not be indicative of how you should be feeling. So the example that I'll give, I've used in a previous webinar, but I think it's powerful. It was what really brought home the difference in how it can be our thoughts and not what's actually happening that creates the suffering. So there was a story that one of my mentors told about a client that she worked with, and he was a Balinese gentleman who he basically, of course, from Bali, and in Bali they have a caste system, and it dictates apparently that for certain higher caste individuals, you have this tooth filing ceremony when you get to be a certain age. And it's not a ceremony that is allowed to be watched, apparently, by people of a lower caste. So this particular man was in love with a woman, and she had her tooth filing ceremony. And he snuck in and watched it from the back of the room, apparently, unbeknownst to anyone, because he wasn't supposed to be there. And he carried with him great shame and guilt around watching this woman get her teeth filed. And he had thoughts like, I shouldn't have done that, and I'm a bad person for doing so, and what would happen if people found out? And so basically, he's sharing this story, and my mentor is thinking, how can it be such a big deal that tooth filing could create such a big amount of suffering in this man, having witnessed this? Because if you or I, potentially, unless you're Balinese and you relate to this situation, but if I'm assuming if you're raised in Western culture and this is a ceremony that's unknown to you, when you hear that, you think, what's the big deal? Like, it can't be that big of a deal. So you watched a tooth filing ceremony. But for him, this thought that he shouldn't have watched it was creating years of suffering that he had carried with him. So just an example that your thoughts may feel so real, and they may feel like they deserve the suffering that they create, but in fact, they may not. They may not even be true. Or if they have been told to you as truth, they may be worth examining to see if they actually are true, because you may find that your truth is different than the culture's truth, than your family of origin's truth, than your religion's truth, and any of those other areas that can, I guess, create a disconnect between what's happening in your mind and what actually is true for you. So I also want to share another one of my favorite people who has spoken about this, and man, she is qualified to do so. She is a neuroscientist, or was a neuroscientist at Harvard. Her name is Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. She wrote a book called My Stroke of Insight because at age I think 37, she had a stroke that took her left brain offline. And of course, our left brain is the part of the brain that is associated with language. And so she was for months and then really years after that without full functioning left brain. And for the first several months, she had no language whatsoever. So she could really watch what was happening in her mind without what she calls the spin doctor in your left brain. And this is a quote I'm going to read you, and then I'll give you an example, but this one is a little bit too long to share the screen, so I'm just going to read it to you. So this is from her book, My Stroke of Insight. She writes, "The most prominent characteristic of our left brain is its ability to weave stories. This storyteller portion of our left mind's language center is specifically designed to make sense of the world outside us based on minimal amounts of information." And this will be important. I'm going to share with you an example of this in a moment. The left brain functions by taking whatever details it has to work with and then weaves them together in the form of a story. Most impressively, our left brain is brilliant in its ability to make stuff up and fill in the blanks when there are gaps in its factual data. I need to be very wary of my storyteller's potential for stirring up drama and trauma. And she has some fabulous examples in her book, but the one that I want to share with you, this comes from another teacher that I love, Byron Katie, and I'm going to be sharing some of her work here later in the webinar. But she wrote that when a story that from her own life that really brought this home. So she went into a restroom in a restaurant, and as she was going into the stall, she passed an elderly woman coming out of the stall, and the elderly woman was humming as she was washing her hands. And so Byron Katie, she goes by Katie, but Katie said basically she walked into the stall and the toilet seat was covered in water, and her first thought was, How rude that woman didn't even notice that she peed all over the seat and she did nothing about it. So that's story number one that her left brain came up with. And then as she was ruminating a little more while she was in the stall, she thought, oh, you know what? That older woman was humming and seemed very like happy and maybe a little spacey. So she thought maybe she has a memory disorder. Maybe she just isn't quite aware of her surroundings to the degree that another person would be. And she didn't notice. Oh, and that gave her a feeling of compassion in her heart. And so there was story number two that her left brain came up with minimal evidence. And then the final thing she landed on was, wow, wait a minute. What if that was a man who was perhaps transgender but hadn't had the full transition surgery yet, something to that effect, and he peed all over the seat. And then she went back to frustration because she thought, why would this man have peed all over the seat and done nothing about it? And so here she went to 3 different stories, and then she finally flushed the toilet and water sprayed up from inside the bowl onto the seat. And it had nothing to do with any of the 3 stories that her mind had come up with. And while this may seem like a trivial example, it is indicative of what your mind can do in big areas of your life, like your relationship. So the point being that it is our job to examine any thoughts that bring us suffering, because chances are they may not even be true. And yet we are letting these thoughts keep us stuck and keep us from moving forward, and also have us making very big assumptions about the other person. I mean, I'm talking here about relationship. This can apply to your colleagues, to your other family members, to your friends. It really applies everywhere, but of course, our narrow scope is around relationships. So just think, you could be assuming major things that may not even be the truth. So again, it is our job to manage our minds and to examine any thoughts that bring us suffering. So I want to just make a distinction here, and this is from my coaching tradition, and of course, if you follow Martha Beck, you may be aware of this, but the idea of clean pain versus dirty pain, and this is just another way to bring home this idea of what can happen when our left brain, like the spin doctor runs amok. It's like a toddler with a knife. It's just not good. So you kind of have to monitor this, you need to monitor the situation and take the knife away from the toddler, basically. So clean pain is the pain that we experience that is normal to be experienced in a certain situation, and we're not spinning off into all kinds of crazy potential. So for example, let's say you lose your parent and they pass away. There is going to be grief associated with that. There will be loss. And I know, if you have a complicated relationship with your parents, that may add some other elements, but let's just say it's a situation where you are close to your parent and the parent dies. There will be pain, grief associated with it. That is normal. We are humans. We are wired to experience these kind of emotions. The dirty pain portion comes when you let your mind spin out of control, making up stories around what that death means. So for example, no one will ever love me like that parent did. I am alone in the world now. Who is ever going to be there to catch me if I fall? Like those kind of things. So those are dirty pain thoughts. Another way I've explained this to clients before is you go to a baseball game, you get hit with the ball. That hurts. That would be clean pain that you were experiencing. Dirty pain would be the thoughts that come along behind it, like the batter was out to get me, outdoor sports are unsafe, I will never allow my children to play baseball, that kind of a thing. So it's what your mind does with an event, what your mind makes it mean and then spins off out of control with, that's the dirty pain. So the bottom line is to question the thoughts that cause you suffering and to find your truth. And again, just remember that if a thought is causing you suffering, it really is an invitation to examine it, not just live with it. So I want to share, when the dirty pain kicks up, I want to share some very quick and dirty tips around this. When I work with clients, we usually spend at least several weeks getting acclimated to this kind of work. And then it can be, a years and years of practice really solidifying the work. It's like wiggling a tooth so that it falls out. It's persistent, consistent effort. It doesn't just fall out. You have to work it. And keep in mind that if you've been thinking certain thoughts for years, potentially even decades, you have neural pathways that are solidified in your brain. Now, the cool thing about neuroplasticity that we know now is that you have complete control to create new neural pathways and dissolve ones that aren't serving you. It's not like your brain is fixed. That's the good news. But the bad news is you can't just work on these thoughts for 5 minutes on one day and think they're going to go away. It really becomes a practice. And with my clients, I like it to become a knee-jerk reaction that you question a thought that causes you suffering. So I'm giving you some quick and dirty tips and some suggestions on resources. And if you have questions, of course, reach out to me. But please keep in mind that I'm doing this in a super fast format. So, and this is an amalgamation of several teachers' works that I draw from very regularly in my practice. So, number one, write the thoughts down that are causing you suffering. And when I say it causes you suffering, meaning there is a physical response in the body like contraction or a sick gut feeling, or your head gets kind of floaty and spinny, anything that causes physical discomfort, and anything that causes emotional discomfort, that makes you angry, that makes you sad, that makes you fearful. So those are the thoughts. If you're experiencing fear, sadness, anger, if you're experiencing contraction, heaviness in the body, write it down. Write down the thought. If you're having trouble identifying what the thought is, you can do like what one of my teachers calls a thought download. And you just basically write for 5 minutes and just spew whatever's in there, and then go back and look at it and see if you can identify what's really going on in your head. So number one, write it down. Number two, what I want you to do is notice again how the thought makes you feel. So really notice, like from an emotional perspective and from a physical perspective, how does it make you feel? So one of the thoughts that I experienced a lot when I was married was that my husband should care more. And I had a very particular idea, I guess, of what caring should look like. So I would think, oh, he should care more. And it would make me angry, and it would make me resentful. Sometimes it would make me sad because I felt unloved or not cherished. Again, I had ideas about what a spouse should be doing. And so it was causing me a great amount of discomfort. And when I would even now, looking back, if I let that thought rest in my awareness, he should care more, I immediately feel like this clench in my heart space, like a contraction. And usually, I've talked about this in past webinars, when we say something that is not true, this is why a polygraph test works for the most part, our body reacts immediately and automatically. And usually part of that reaction is muscular contraction. Usually there's muscular weakness with it too. And of course, increased respiration, perspiration, eye blinking, but that's the stuff like the polygraph picks up. But just know for our purposes, if you feel contraction in the body when you let a thought rest in your awareness, it can be an indicator that it is a big fat lie, as Amy Ehlers puts it. So just notice, once you've written down the thought, let the thought rest in your awareness. Just notice how it makes you feel emotionally and physically. Okay, so if this thought is causing you suffering, then I'm going to invite you to find a better feeling thought. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. Byron Katie calls these turnarounds. I think Abraham Hicks talks about reaching for the better feeling thought. So people call it different things. But the idea is to reframe the thought in a different way that feels better. So let's just take my example that that my husband should care more. Like that's the thought that caused me a lot of discomfort among many other thoughts, but I'll just pick this one. So he should care more. So let's find a better feeling thought. How about he does care, but it's in his own way. He cares in his own way. And I could think of examples of that. Well, he works really, really hard to support the family. He puts in a lot of hours. So maybe he shows love by working really hard and providing, the love languages that book, The 5 Love Languages, that's been so popular for so many years. I like it a lot, and I find it very applicable, but perhaps his love language is different than mine and he does care. So basically reach for a better feeling thought. Another thought that I could reach for is, turning it around, like to the opposite. I should care more. And when I looked at that thought, I found places where it could be true. And it made me feel better because it gave me compassion for my spouse. Now, I can still point fingers at all the ways he should have cared more, but when I turned it on myself, I realized there were a lot of places where I wasn't fully engaged in the marriage. I wasn't providing the emotional connection that I think that my husband desired a lot. And so no wonder that he would seem like he didn't care. Like we were both creating the situation. So when you reach for a thought that feels better, reach for a thought that feels better in your body, reach for a thought that creates better feeling emotions for you. And then once you do that, you noticed a minute ago how I started looking for evidence. Once you find a thought that feels better, then you can find evidence for it, because this is where the mind likes evidence. This is how you create the new neural pathways to support a better feeling story. So reach for evidence. So an example that I also wanted to share around this that I think is really interesting. So another one of my teachers, when she was working with a client, this was a client who had a belief, a very, very strong belief when it came to his marriage and his life, that all women need to be taken care of. And in truth, it really was just his mother and his wife that were demanding to be taken care of. But in his mind, women need to be taken care of. This was the thought that he'd been living with for decades at this point, because it started in his family of origin with his mom, and then he married someone who was very similar to his mom. So he had this thought, women need to be taken care of. And so once he hit my teacher's office and he's saying, yeah, all women need to be taken care of. And my teacher looked at him, and number one, she's a woman. But number two, she said, you can't think of one woman in the entire world who doesn't need to be taken care of. And he was, you can tell his eyes were going left and right, which usually is an indication that your mind is working to find an answer. He was like, yeah, no, all women need to be taken care of. And she said, well, what about me? And he was like, oh, well, I guess I don't need to take care of you. And then she said, what about Oprah? What about Hillary Clinton? What about, he named any of the women out there that you see in the world. And he was like, oh my gosh. So this is just evidence that if you have been giving your mind one story for years and years and years, it doesn't have any evidence for the opposite or for the better feeling thought. So it's your job to go find that evidence to create new neural pathways that support a better feeling story. And when it comes to marriage, for example, I used to have a belief that divorce was not an option. This was a saying that was repeated when I was younger at every, at the very conservative summer camp that I attended, at the churches that I attended. It was repeated in youth groups that I attended. And so it was, it was of course tied more to a religious thing, but that was the belief. Divorce is not an option. And I used to repeat it. I never questioned it until I got in the situation where I was really unhappy in my marriage. And I had to look around and think, okay, let's find the better feeling thought. Maybe divorce is an option. Can I find where that's true? And so I looked around and I thought of a lot of examples of people in my own life who'd gotten divorced and found their greatest love the second time around. I looked out into the world and I saw women who were leaving abusers, for example, and they were leading much healthier, happier, safer lives. So divorce was an option there. I even looked out in the world and I saw certain celebrities who I thought, oh yeah, they really needed to get a divorce. That was a bit of a train wreck of a marriage. So, just find, even if you can find one little bit of evidence for the new story, that's all you need to start working with, and wiggle that tooth persistently, consistently. Okay, so pitfalls that I see the most with clients that I don't want you to fall into is number one, believing all of your thoughts. For all the reasons we've talked about here today, you don't have to believe your thoughts, even if they feel so real and so true. My suggestion is that they may not be as true as you think, and it's worth exploring either on your own or getting support in that department. And then number two, remaining trapped in the prison that your mind has created, not questioning the thoughts. It really is one of the examples I heard is it's like you're holding the prison bars up. It's like a little cutout of prison bars, and you're just holding it up in front of your face. It is absolutely within your control to not stay trapped with those thoughts. So if you want to take this further and you want to explore the actual nitty-gritty of working through some thoughts together, I'm going to put a little link to my scheduler right here. I'm going to pop this in the chat box. And of course, if you are not here watching this live or viewing the video later, then I will invite you to go to my website, unhitchedbook.com. There you can download a free copy of my book that talks a lot about all of these things. And it also has my contact info. So that's unhitchedbook.com. And then I invite you to join me again next week for the continuation of these Unhitched webinar shorts. And next week, we're going to be talking about feeling all the feels. So basically emotions, not something that I think most people have received much training on in families of origin, or this is not something they really cover in school, but I think it should be. So how to deal with emotions, because most of us either don't know how to identify them or don't know how to feel them or just don't know what to do with them, maybe a little scared about them. So I will see you next week. Thank you for joining me. Bye.